I just finished reading The Golden Rules by Bob Bowman. And Bob Bowman is a swimming coach. He's taught a lot of high school age kids how to swim faster and be more competitive, and eventually ended up coaching a lot of Olympians and winning a lot of medals for them, or helping them win their medals. Now, one person in particular that he coached was Michael Phelps, who he met when he was about 15 years old. And Michael Phelps eventually became the greatest Olympian ever. He won a total of 28 medals. I believe the second most medals won by anyone was 18. The most won in a single year was 7, and then he won 8. And the most gold won was 9. The most gold he won was 23. So he just completely smashed all these goals. He set tons of world records for swimming, and he very much thanks his coach, Bob Bowman, for that. Now, Bob Bowman always considered him to be the type of person who gets up late because he wouldn't show up until about 7 a.m. for swim practice. And they did swim practice every day, by the way, 365 days. Michael Phelps actually was talking to someone who was like, "Oh, that's so crazy, you practice on Christmas?" And he wasn't too happy about practicing on Christmas, but when he heard that, he was like, yeah. And then he was always excited to practice on Christmas, even though it was ridiculous and he didn't have to. So that was one cool thing. But Bob Bowman always woke up at 4:30 to start his day. So he was like, "Oh, Michael Phelps is a late riser," because he was so much earlier. Even though 7 a.m. is pretty early, that's not late at all in my book. So basically, the way that they planned out their goals was they would set a long-term goal and a midterm goal and what they have to do today. And they would really, really focus on the today goal. The longer-term goals, they would be very selective for who they told those goals to. So Michael Phelps and his coach and maybe his parents would be the only one to know his long-term goal. He never really talked to the media about what he planned to do, what medals he wanted to win, what times he wanted to beat. They actually didn't really go for medals at all. They said that you should not compare yourself to other people because you don't know what those other people are going to do. And this relates to businesses. You can't say, "I want to be better than Amazon," because you don't know where Amazon is going to be when you move. You could get bigger than Amazon is now, but Amazon is also growing, so they might outpace you in that respect. So it's very, very hard to base your results on being better than someone else. But what they do is they'll say, "Okay, this time is the best ever. I'm going to beat this time." And then they go into the Olympics with a goal of beating that time. And it turns out that they will beat that time and someone else will beat that time as well. And that would result in a success, even though you didn't win the medal, because you couldn't have anticipated that your finish line would change. So they have their set finish line, and they work towards that with their everyday goals. Another thing he says is that when he writes down his everyday goals, he goes back during bad times. So if things aren't working out, he'll go back to, a year when Michael Phelps won 8 golds in the Olympics, and he'll be like, "Okay, what was I doing on these days leading up to that?" They have a 4-year window that they have to practice for the Olympics because there's a Summer Olympics every 4 years. So they'll look at what they did in the time leading up to that next Olympics. Now, they actually, at one point, had all these amazing Olympians all training together. And it was sort of like a business incubator, like a startup incubator, where you have all these different people in similar businesses. They all basically swim for a living, and they have these sponsorships. And it's not really a team sport, but they make it feel like one because you're with all these other people on the same journey as you. And they said that that is kind of what helps as well. It's easier to stay motivated. He also says in terms of motivation, you should switch it up sometimes. He gives this example of a football coach taking his team to go to like a zoo and like just this random stuff just to break up the day and keep it interesting. Something that he did personally with his swimmers, including Michael Phelps and the others, was he took them to be trained by the Navy. So he took his whole team, and then the Navy drill sergeant took over for the day. And some of them hated it, some of them liked it, but they definitely got pushed. And then afterwards, they were like, "Oh, this trainer's not that bad." Bob Bowman, which he kind of seemed like a jerk, but he was very successful, so I guess that worked out for him. Okay, so one more thing was, again, I've talked about this in most every book, but he does say that he pays a lot of attention to the details. And with Michael Phelps, there's this great story about how the details really added up for him and made it really work out. So with Michael Phelps, he had his goggles. I just happen to have these on the shelf right where I put the camera. But he had his goggles crushed by Bob Bowman one day while he was at a meet. And he trained him so that he would count the number of strokes he made to get to one side and back to the other, so he didn't really need to see. He could basically do his job blindfolded. So he crushes his goggles by on purpose, and Michael Phelps doesn't know it. And then he realizes when his goggles start filling up. And he eventually makes it back, and I think he wins that race. That was a less important race a couple years earlier. Then if we fast forward to the Olympics, his goggles actually malfunctioned. Of course, his coach wouldn't sabotage his Olympics. It was a less important game the first time. But this time it actually happens. And he's ready for it because he's trained for it, and he's actually had it happen before, so he knows exactly what to do. He ends up winning that race. And then another thing they talk about is Bob always said that Michael's job is to get his hands on the wall, because once you finish the race, there's like this plate that you hit, and that stops the timer to let you know your time on the board. And he always taught him to hit it as forcefully as he could and lunge into it. So this one race, which turned out to be, I think this was the race where he set the world record for something, and he was neck and neck with this one guy. This guy was actually ahead of him, and he's getting up close, and they finish, and the other guy hits the wall slightly before him, but Michael hits the wall almost at the same time, but he thrusts, the other guy just glides into it, so the plate actually ended up hitting the sensor faster for Michael, even though he was slightly behind. He ends up winning the race by 0.01. 0.01 seconds is what he wins the race by. So those two examples are huge attention to detail and real-life examples of how those little tiny details, fractions of a second, made massive differences and basically set world records.